In the 5th century, one man brought terror and destruction to millions across Europe. Attila the Hun and his bloodthirsty barbarians tortured, raped, and murdered all who stood in their way. According to legend, they dipped their arrows in the juice of boiled embryos, drank women's blood, and were descended from unclean spirits. Attila's ruthlessness knew no bounds. He slaughtered deserters and murdered his own brother. His savage Huns struck fear into the mighty Roman Empire with their brutality. They razed great cities to the ground and massacred whole populations in pursuit of gold. Christians believed he'd been sent from hell to punish sinners. Attila became known as the Scourge of God.
He's different from anyone else. He is more ferocious than anyone else. He is more efficient than anyone else. He frightens everybody.
From the day he was born, in 406 AD, much was expected of Attila.
He would have grown up as a member of a large extended royal family, knowing that he was going to have to compete for power. The stakes were very high because if he lost, he'd probably be dead.
Despite his privileged position, Attila experienced terror at a very young age.
One tradition that we're told about the Huns is that the male babies, when they were born, had their cheeks slashed so that they learnt to bear pain at a very early age.
Like all Hunnic males, he was encouraged to ride before he could walk.
They're virtually born in the saddle, they eat in the saddle, they converse and they hold diplomatic talks whilst in the saddle. This is exaggerated, of course, by the ancient sources which say, get a Hun off a horse and he can't walk.
Attila's people were feared for their violent plundering. They descended from Mongolia, travelled west, and settled in Pannonia on the Danube, where Budapest now stands. 5th century Europe was dominated by the mighty Roman Empire. Their relationship with the savage Huns was very fragile.
By the time the Huns are situated on the Great Hungarian Plain, they are in part parasitic already on the Roman Empire in a rather different way, in the sense that they're extracting cash. Sometimes they're doing this through annual tributes levied from the Romans. Sometimes they're getting it by serving as mercenaries in Roman armies.
Attila grew up in a violent, merciless society where only the strong survived.
The Huns were in a constant state of warfare with other tribes. There are constant tensions within the royal house as well. So his upbringing would have been pretty insecure.
He probably would have been given his own group of warriors to lead at a very early age, probably in his teens, mid-teens, to judge by other examples. Whether he's really there to command or to be symbolic at that point, I think, is very debatable. But certainly his job at that point would have been to stand at the front and to inspire courage in his warriors, and also learn to face up to battle himself.
His fearless leadership was rewarded with political power.
Sometime between 435 440, we have the name of Attila popping up with his brother Bleda. And for a period, the two of them run this Hunnic group together.
This arrangement infuriated the power-hungry Attila. But Bleda had strong support, and for now he had to bide his time. During his 20s and 30s, Attila led a series of murderous incursions into Roman territory.
The image of the barbarian, particularly the steppe nomad barbarian, is always a bad one. And they're very, very dangerous militarily, and they're very frightening. And you've got a whole society that turns up with all its warrior males on horseback. This is terrifying.
The Huns were known for their deadly lightning attacks.
They can cover a huge amount of ground. They can raid deep into provinces that are unprotected or only protected on the frontiers. And this is a terrible shockwave of fear right the way through Central Europe, because you never knew when these people were going to turn up on your doorstep.
The Hunnic method of warfare is based on using the bow, and Attila is associated with the Hunnic bow.
They could fire arrows standing up on horseback and kill a man at 150 meters. A Hunnic attack was the medieval equivalent of the blitzkrieg.
The Huns were able, therefore, to stand outside the range of most of their enemies, shower them with arrows, make them rush at them, and the sources refer to the fact that the Huns always pretended to run away at that point. Then once the opponents had lost their coherence and cohesion, the Huns would then turn around and pick them off a few at a time.
Alongside his devastating military capability, Attila created a network of informants along the Danube.
Most of his great victories come when the Romans are otherwise engaged. There's clearly a grapevine which operates along the frontier. So he knows, for instance, in his first great campaign in 441, that the main Danubian army has been shipped to Sicily to try and recapture North Africa from the Vandals. And that offers him the opportunity to attack, and his victories then make his name.
He recognized the value of a fearsome reputation.
He uses his methods of terror to frighten people. Now, the way to do this is by sacking cities. Early on, he approaches the city of Naissus on the Danube, and they force their way into the city, and the city is sacked. And a few years later, a group of Romans are travelling along, and they have to stop short of the river because it is full of the bones of the slain.
For Attila's savage army, life was cheap.
The Huns had no regard for anyone else's human rights. We have quite a few records of what supposedly represents the comments of Hunnic leaders about Romans or about other people. In fact, it's very common amongst these nomads. They basically have two categories. They have themselves as masters and everybody else as slaves. And slaves are entirely dispensable. So you're either dominant in this world or you're dominated, and if you're dominated, then you're completely expendable.
They would inflict maximum casualties without any respect for human life at all, and that is a characteristic of the terrorist.
Although he tasted victory abroad, at home, Attila was losing patience with his brother and craved absolute power.
For many years, Attila and Bleda did cooperate as leaders either of different factions of the Huns or as joint leaders of the whole lot. But Attila was the kind of man who had to rule alone, and in the end it was going to be either Bleda or him.
Attila had his brother Bleda murdered in his sleep. At the age of 40, he became sole leader of the Huns. His priority was to expand the Hunnic war machine. Knowing how effective a combined barbarian fighting force would be against the Romans, he brought together various tribal groups.
His early years as king were spent consolidating the coalition with the Ostrogoths and the Gepids and the other subject tribes. Once that was done, he could start on his career of terrorizing cities.
Once he had political control over the Huns, the heavily superstitious Attila sought spiritual guidance.
Attila would have been brought up with the Huns' own myths about their mission in life. Their success was due to divine guidance.
There was one key moment when a sign from God was built into Attila's charismatic image. And that's when a rusty old sword was found and brought to him. Attila is said to have declared at this point that the gift of the sword to him from the gods showed that he was destined to conquer.
Attila is overjoyed. This is the sword of Mars. This guarantees him victory. And of course he tells everybody about it. He wants fame. He wants glory. He wants people to be impressed. And while this is a means to an end, to get more power, to get more money, it is also an end in itself, because honour, glory, reputation are things that every great leader wants.
Attila now controlled the united barbarian tribes and had the gods on his side. He was primed to attack the superpower of the Roman Empire. Attila, king of the Huns, had 500,000 bloodthirsty barbarian warriors at his disposal. He began launching plunder attacks deep into the Eastern Roman Empire. In 446, his armies swept across the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. They pillaged churches, desecrated the graves of saints, and slaughtered civilians. Attila enjoyed these apocalyptic scenes. He would roll his eyes in delight at the terror he inspired. He conquered more than 100 cities. There was so much loss of life that no one could count the dead.